Okay, as the off season for college sports is really happening now, I figured dive into some of the more interesting topics going around the college sports landscape. So joining me today, we got Jesse Dougherty. He writes for the Washington Post. I don't know if we've got any Nats fans who listen, but you might have seen his coverage, read his book on the Nats, which I loved. But he's here to talk college sports, which is what he's all about now. So Jesse, thanks so much for hopping on.
You did two things that no one does. You pronounced my last name correctly, and you called what I cover interesting.
Hey, it is to a lot of people here in Connecticut, and I think if they don't find it interesting by the time they finish listening to this, they will. Uh, I'm trying to even think of just how to even start this conversation with you. I mean, the NIL, this whole landscape has just changed so much over the past handful of years here to now we finally have some traction in place and some movement with the House settlement coming up soon. So I guess let's just start with that. For those who are kind of newer to the topic, give us just like the 30,000 foot look at this whole House settlement process and how it came to be.
Yeah, so the House settlement's a big deal for a lot of reasons. I think the biggest way it affects UConn or anyone's favorite school is that for the first time ever, these institutions are going to start paying athletes directly. For the
Yeah.
entirety of the NIL era, it's required boosters, constant fundraising by collectives. It has never actually been the school's responsibility to pay athletes through these NIL deals. That will change on July 1st. So there's a lot of high level topics that come with the settlement. It's $2.8 billion in damages. It deals with a lot of antitrust issues. It consolidates three cases: House, Carter, Hubbard. If you follow college sports, you've maybe seen them in italics in stories because they come up often. They were basically challenges to past compensation rules, whether that was with broadcast rights or other things. So but moving forward, schools are now going to be able to pay athletes up to $20.5 million this academic year. That's across sports. It is effectively a salary cap, even though schools will deal with it differently. So there's just a lot going on. Rosters are getting crunched a bit. There's more scholarship money to go around. It goes on and on. We could talk about this probably for 10 hours. I'm not sure who would listen, but there's a lot of stuff going on with it.
Yeah. When you think through all of the development over the past several months here, especially with that July 1st date looming, what would you say are maybe the biggest couple of takeaways that'll be impacting college sports starting July 1st?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is an unanswered question, which it
Yeah.
feels like this lawsuit was supposed to provide a lot of certainty. And as things go in college sports, it provided some certainty, but it also provides a lot of additional uncertainties, right? So we know based on the past couple years that the biggest spenders often do really well. Now, UConn basketball might say we have a pretty good collective up in stores, but we weren't spending like Kentucky and Duke, and we still won a couple of championships, right?
Yeah.
So it's not always that the most money wins, right? But last year there was a ton of coverage of Ohio State's $20 million football roster.
Yeah.
We know that Oregon spends and spends and spends, and they had an undefeated season. So there's sort of some truths to this era, and one of them is that money does get you to a certain level. It doesn't get you all the way there, but it gets you to a certain level. The unanswered question that I think is a really big deal this summer is that if most schools are spending to that $20.5 million cap, and that means that most of them have around $13 million for their football programs based on the formulas we've seen publicly, how do you get ahead then?
Yeah.
So like because everyone's not going to spend the same. That's not how college sports have ever worked. Boosters exist because there's an ability to reach into your pocket, right? I'm doing that. I don't think there's no video here, right? But I'm reaching into my pocket. I don't have any money in it, but there's this ability to do that and influence results,
Yeah.
right? That was true with Miami in the 80s and 90s. That was true with the bagmen who was giving money in McDonald's bags, and it's been true in the NIL era more than ever. So that's still going to happen in some way or some form. The NCAA would love it for it not to, but we just know that motivated rich people affect college results.
Yeah.
So how that happens in the wake of this settlement is fascinating to me. I don't think we know the extent of it. It might take years to understand how it's going to play out, but that to me is a major question still.
As you talk about that $20.5 million cap, what percentage of schools say it that we'll start, I guess, just at the FBS level, do you see actually maxing out that 20.5 million?
It's an interesting question. I mean, so every power conference school, so that's the Big Five, because
Yeah.
the Pac-12 was a defendant, but really it's the Big Four now, has to participate. They don't have to spend to 20.5 million, but they have to participate.
Yep.
I do think that just to compete, you'll see a lot of those schools get, if not at that top number, really close. I think the schools that are really interesting are not UConn necessarily, but the Big East schools don't have football because
Yeah.
now are you going to put all 20 million toward these sports? Do you sort of do a prorated version where you spend 10, but that means you can keep up with the basketball programs that are also spending on football?
Yeah.
Those schools have a lot more flexibility because they can say, maybe we push another million into basketball and get ahead. Or we know that Vanderbilt and UConn and Duke are spending about this on basketball. We want to stay in that range. So we don't have to go all the way. The rules aren't different for those
Yeah.
schools, these schools without football. It's the same as it is for ACC and the Big 12 and the SEC and Big 10. So I think there are a lot of those Power Four schools will get to that level.
Mhm.
Outside of that, I'll be really curious to see. And I'm not sure we'll ever really fully know. I think a lot of ADs will either try and posture and say it publicly. A lot will try to shield it and not really reveal much. There's some strategic elements to that too. So it's going to be kind of a, I don't want to say lawless, but it's going to be sort of a dataless landscape in a lot of ways.
Yeah. When you mention the Big East here, I know that's an interesting point for a lot of people who are listening and watching this. When you saw, I think it was like post-settlement, you saw the conference commissioners from the Big Four there. I think the Pac-12 was on there. The Big East was notably absent from that. How do you think the Big East kind of stands in this landscape? Are they kind of on the outside looking in here?
Yeah, well, they certainly weren't in the room to hash out any of the settlement terms,
Yeah.
right? Because the reason why those commissioners were present is because they were the ones who had their names in the lawsuit along with the NCAA. Now, as your listeners will probably like to hear, like I believe the Big East is in that group because of its basketball prowess. It's not, it's not FBS football, obviously. So and so it's there's sort of some confusing elements there, but I think that the Big East is really interesting. Now I know St. John's coming off all their spending last year would love to have one of the biggest basketball payrolls in the country, and they
Yeah.
feel that this settlement allows them to do that, where they can not just rely on big donors and we all read a lot about that last year and their money man. They can sort of go internally and get those funds. So I think the Big East is really interesting. I mean, on one hand, they sort of were left out in terms of hashing out what this new world will look like, but you can see a world in which it does benefit them in some ways, solely because for most of the schools in the conference, football is not a consideration, and you
Right.
don't have to spend and spend and spend and keep up with the Joneses there. There are so many schools in the Power Four that have no shot to ever make noise in football, but because of their donors, they have to spend a bunch of money, right?
Right.
Where you
Yeah.
like just don't do it. But it's just not how it works.
Right. When you look at the Big East, obviously from their perspective, that also here in Connecticut, and if you're a college basketball fan, I know a lot of people like the Cinderella teams. How do you see some of these conferences, whether it's you're looking at a team like Quinnipiac, maybe here in Connecticut, or an A10 team? How do those schools kind of survive in this kind of landscape where you're talking about such big money being thrown around?
Yeah, it's tough because, this year, as the NIL market has matured, we saw obviously four number one seeds in the Final Four,
Yeah.
an incredible dearth of Cinderella teams in the tournament at large. I think it's hard to really know if that's a sign of what's to come, a one-off, an aberration, whatever it is. But it didn't feel good, I think, for those people who are fans of parity in college basketball to see that,
Yeah.
especially 4 years into the NIL era. Now, are there ways in which this new sort of market can help those teams? I wonder if you're sort of a low major basketball program, if you do revenue share a bit.
Yeah.
I know schools like Morgan State or Mount St. Mary's are planning to. They're certainly not going to spend $20.5 million, but they're trying to maybe excel in certain sports. Mount St. Mary's, it's men's and women's basketball. Morgan State, it could be football. And maybe if you're winning the recruiting battles at your conference and putting together the best roster you can
Yeah.
at that level. It's not 5 stars. Maybe it's, 2, 3 star recruits, even lower, but you're getting the best guys because you're spending some money. You're giving yourself the best shot maybe to make noise in March. So
Yeah.
like I think there's an opportunity where if some schools can raise the money, if they can go in the couch cushions and find that $500,000 here and there, maybe there's a chance to consolidate the best of that level of talent the reality is you go to the Sweet 16 and your entire roster is going to wind up on a Power Four team next year, which just stinks, right? Because
Yeah.
it's so hard to keep those guys now. But for one season, if you make some noise, I think this era could allow you, because you're not just solely relying on donors that frankly don't really exist as much at that level.
Yeah.
You can find the institutional funds to do it. You could maybe stand out and make a run. But that's also really hard to do. But I guess that's why it's worth it.
Exactly. I guess we'll see how this kind of plays out over the next few years here to see if the 4-1 seeds becomes just kind of the norm based on the spending, or if we still get to enjoy some Cinderellas and upsets come March. As you go through some of these other settlement terms, what else kind of stands out to you, just as you're looking at from a whole?
Yeah, I mean the reshaping of rosters is interesting. I think, you think about the idea of Cinderella teams in March Madness. There's also going to be fewer walk-ons on
Mhm.
schools that participate in this, because what the settlement did was it created roster limits in each sport, but removed spending caps on scholarship money. So in football, for example, it used to be you could give out 85
Yeah.
scholarships, but you could have as many as 130, 140 players. Now you can only have 105 players, but you can give each one of them a scholarship. So
Okay.
the number goes down. So now let's say a roster had 130, that goes down to 105, but now your scholarship allotment can go up by 20.
Mhm.
So now maybe Rudy isn't in there anymore,
Yeah.
right? And that's a story that people love. And I think that's more on, it's not necessarily a story that catches on nationally, but walk-ons are beloved on campuses. They're
Definitely.
For students, they're really fun because it's someone who might be in your lecture or live on your floor. It's a little more accessible. You chant for the guy and even if he's not going to get in the game. So like those connection points, they might not affect the value of the CBS deal or the ESPN deal, right? But I think they might affect on an individual level the enjoyment for some of these teams. So it's it's hard to know what parts of this settlement are actually noticeable for people, right? Because a lot of
Mhm.
this stuff is like, I mean, if an athlete's getting paid for cost of attendance or not, either way, I'm watching and see if he gets a sack. Like I don't think about his Alston money,
Right.
right? When I tune on
Yeah.
Saturday. But over time, you might realize, man, I used to hear a lot of cool walk-on stories from the student newspaper, or I used to see like a bunch of like short dudes or women come into the game at the end, and we would go crazy. And now they're all on scholarship, and UConn has, everyone on the roster is 6'8" and above. Like it's just a different feeling. So I think that's a way in which college sports is really unique. Walk-ons are not going to go away entirely because some programs will still have them, but the ability to give scholarships to your entire roster will certainly change the makeup of these teams. And I think that's something that could be noticeable down the line.
No, very, very interesting. I'm curious to look a little bit at one point of it with when it comes to like the NIL deals for these players and how Deloitte's now playing a role in kind of analyzing these deals over $600. Take us through what that process is going to look like and how you see that playing out here.
Yeah, I think that's one part of this the that experts and lawyers think is really ripe for future lawsuits. Like
Hmm.
in some ways, these lawsuits stem from antitrust issues
Yeah,
and from the NCAA potentially breaking antitrust law. I mean, obviously, these cases didn't go to trial. They settled before a judge would fully decide on the merits of the case. But I do believe that trying to cap earnings and trying to sort of determine what someone's market value is, rather than just leaving it
letting the
up to
market.
what
Yeah.
someone letting the market dictate it, like that could be a violation of antitrust principles, right? In the Sherman Act. So I think it could just spiral forward. Now, I know that the NCAA and power conferences are trying to put mechanisms in place where schools can't challenge that legally. I I don't know if there's really things to stop future athletes from doing so. I think it will be really interesting to see how that plays out. But
Definitely.
basically, anything at $600 or above has to go through this clearinghouse, and using formulas and a lot of data and all the submitted deals that this clearinghouse is going to collect. Deloitte and the power conferences and this new college sports commission will decide, frankly, if these deals can go through. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of thorniness with that, right? So yeah, I'm not sure. I'm fascinated. That first case could be a bombshell, or it could just fall limp, and
Right.
we'll see how many more changes are coming down the line.
Just like Alex, grilling season is back. And while our favorite team reloads, it's your turn to load up the grill with Martin Rosel's, the best meats Connecticut has to offer. Since 1928, Martin Rosel's has been crafting top quality hot dogs, kielbasa, and sausages using original recipes and only the finest ingredients. So as the warm weather returns, remember, both championship teams and great cookouts start with the right lineup. Look for Rosel's at your local grocery store or stop by their retail store in New Britain. And now, back to the episode. I'm very interested to see how that part in particular plays out. If anyone subscribes to your email newsletter, they'll see you've done some writing recently about some legislation at the federal level that's going on around a lot of these topics. So where do things stand? And maybe just give us a quick overview of kind of the latest in DC.
Yeah, after the settlement, there was a flurry of activity in the House of Representatives, not in the Senate. Any bill, if it were to get passed, has to go through both chambers,
Yep.
which means at some point it would require some bipartisan support because Republicans have the majority in both chambers, also in the White House, in the NLRB too, all these things, but they don't have a filibuster-proof majority, meaning that if Democrats were emboldened enough to block any sort of bill Republicans introduced, they could make it so it can't get through the Senate, basically, without 60 votes. Generally, these things have split along party lines. Republicans have been NCAA friendly. They've been amenable to antitrust protections. They've been amenable to making it so athletes can never become employees. They've been amenable to laws, a bill that would make it so state laws cannot supersede NCAA or power conference rules in this new
Mhm.
world. Democrats have generally either not really cared and not really engaged, or felt like some of those things, namely the antitrust protections and the employment clause, were something they were not going to support. So it's been really hard to get any sort of bipartisan traction in DC.
Mhm.
That said, in the House, at least three committees started working on a bill together, which does up the chances of it getting through the House of Representatives. It's does not mean that there's going to be legislation, right? There's been more than a dozen hearings to this point. No bill has really advanced that far. If you read these stories by me or Ross Dellinger or Steve Berkowitz or whoever, like they all start to read very similarly because we've done the same thing over and over and over. But to me, the interesting thing was that I think this a lot of college administrators rightfully kind of go with one track at a time because there's so much going on. And I can imagine, and I know because I've heard that once that settlement was approved, a lot of people, presidents and ADs, picked up their phone to their local rep and said, "Hey, we need you to get to the table now, right? Like we figured that out. We got the settlement out of the way. We could really use some congressional help." So the heat turned up. I don't know if that will matter
Yeah.
because the heat's been on for a long time. The lobbying dollars have been spent in troves, but we have seen a little bit of uptick in activity. Now it's stalled a bit. There's a lot going on in the world, as we know. Congress is pretty busy. When I call offices, I usually joke, I hope you're not thinking about college sports today, but I have to ask because there are a lot of other things going on. And sometimes they're like, we actually are. And sometimes they're like, yeah, it's the last thing from our mind. But
Yeah.
that's sort of the state of play there.
Yeah. When you look at one of those issues in particular, I know the athletes as employees is always a big kind of hot button issue. If you had to take a guess, and I know it's really hard to take a guess at things like this, how do you see that argument kind of playing out over the next, kind of couple of years here?
Yeah, it's really interesting because all of the efforts to have athletes recognized through the NLRB were paused after the election because labor advocates who were leading those efforts worried about a Republican controlled and and Trump sort of created board
Mhm.
basically rendering decisions that would lead to precedent that would make it impossible to ever happen. So any sort of effort, you saw the Dartmouth case,
Yeah.
there were some hearings at US about USC, Northwestern, Notre Dame, like those were all paused fully. Now there's still a federal case, Johnson versus NCAA, that is trying to have athletes recognized as employees, making the argument that they deserve minimum wage, and that's still ongoing. Moves really slow, as we know, as cases tend to. So the question really is that so many people have pitched collective bargaining as a solution for a lot of the problems in college sports
Yeah.
would entail athletes and athletic directors and lawyers and schools all coming together to form like a labor agreement like you see in the NBA and NHL and MLB and NFL
Yeah.
The problem with that is collective bargaining almost always requires employment, and they're recognizing that the labor in each case are employees. So if collective bargaining would save this and would actually offer a lot of those antitrust protections that the NCAA has been lobbying
Yeah.
Congress for, the big question is whether they're willing to recognize athletes as employees, and they're not. That's a hill the NCAA is willing to die on. A lot of administrators too. There is just a strong, staunch belief that athletes are not and should not be recognized as employees, which makes collective bargaining really hard to envision and will require some sort of legal carve out. So I'm not sure where the question goes, but it's just such a central part of this because you'll hear over and over pitching of collective bargaining. Jim Harbaugh, before he went to the Chargers, was saying it in almost every press conference. It was like his big thing that they needed to all negotiate together to come up with the next iteration of college sports. The employment piece of that is very tricky. Some groups have pitched collective bargaining without employment. I'm not sure if it can work.
Yeah.
I'd be very curious to see if it gains any traction either in Congress or among college leaders, but that would also require administrators and the NCAA and folks at that level to even want to come to the table with athletes, which I think would be a really monumental step, but also have its own sort of thorniness and questions and uncertainties. So it's fascinating, it's dense, but I think it is a really important question moving forward.
Yeah, as you look at these players getting more and more money, especially with the revenue sharing here, do you see these players having to be held to kind of some sort of contract, especially given the transfer portal buzz and all of that? I mean, we saw what happened with Tennessee football in their quarterback in this offseason. How do you see some of that stuff playing out as you look in kind of the short-term future here?
Yeah, there will certainly be more contracts. There already are. There have been. I think the revenue sharing era will bring on more. There's been some great reporting. I think of Sportico and Daniel Libet and Richard Johnson at CBS Sports that sort of gets behind some of those standard contracts used by conferences, and so that has gotten at some of the forms that conferences and schools have used to put together those contracts.
Yeah,
And yeah, I mean, worth checking out because I do think that revenue sharing does open up the window for a lot more of those negotiations. In a lot of cases, athletes that don't have agents might just be told, "Hey, this is the contract everyone else is signing," and go, and that's how schools will do it. And athletes with representation might try to change those terms. It's interesting how much this can continue to look like pro sports, but also there are so many ways in which it's not, and that's
right,
where
exactly.
area comes in.
Yeah. Some people from around here might be familiar with Charlie Baker, as the governor of Massachusetts, now the president of the NCAA. What do you see his role as the president of the NCAA being right now?
It's a great question. I mean, I think when Charlie Baker was hired for that job, a big reason was because as a Republican governor in a traditionally very blue state, he had proven an ability to work across the aisle, to get things done, to pass legislation in Massachusetts as a Republican. And the NCAA and its leaders were really looking for someone to sort of provide the magic bullet in Washington.
Yeah.
And we're now a few years into Baker's tenure, and that has not happened, obviously. And I think that remains sort of one of his biggest tasks is trying to figure that out, him and his team. Now, is that the only thing he does? No. A lot of this settlement system, though, will be run by the power conferences
Yeah.
and not the NCAA. So now, outside of the congressional bit, like the NCAA runs March Madness, that's its major thing. The NCAA negotiates those media deals, which are not, actively being negotiated right now, but that's also a major thing. I think sort of the growth of women's sports and figuring out how to push that forward and build on this is a major task of the NCAA and Charlie Baker. I know they're really interested in a lot of gambling legislation to try and protect athletes from online abuse that stems from prop bets and whatnot. So there's a lot to do, but I think the power and the influence of NCAA is certainly diminishing, especially going into this revenue sharing era when the College Sports Commission is gonna really run it, and that's the power conferences put that together. So it's there's a really big task with Congress and politics that I think Baker is still responsible for, but a lot of the things the NCAA has traditionally done in enforcing rules is and doing investigations and monitoring compensation, all those things is going to fall to somebody else now, and that's a big change.
Yeah, I don't know if lame duck is probably the right word to describe the NCAA right now, but do you see it in somewhat of a position where, kind of, I don't want to say fades away completely, but starts to become more and more irrelevant as things continue in this direction?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think there's been like super leagues pitched where the power conference eventually breaks off.
Yeah.
One thing this settlement does is it sort of binds them all together for the 10 years of the settlement.
Okay.
So, I don't, I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not positive if there's ways out of it or loopholes or ways to sort of, change that. But
Yeah.
I do feel that there's certainly a recognition that this is going to be the system for at least the time being because they entered into a legal agreement that frankly is like a collective bargaining agreement in a lot of ways. I mean, it's not, but it sort of functions that way where it sets the rules and it sets the people who carry out the rules and it has all these different sort of tentacles that are going to that the landscape is going to sort of coalesce around now. Now, does the NCAA continue to operate exactly how it has for all eternity? I mean, no, because it's already not going to this year. It's going to have a totally different role, especially with the biggest schools in Division One and the biggest sports. So it's already changing, and whether or not it's fading away entirely, I don't know. But being reworked and being rethought and reimagined, certainly, I think that's already well underway.
All right. Well, I appreciate the deep dive into all of these topics. I know they're on the minds of a lot of fans out here just trying to kind of grasp what's going on in the college landscape right now. Things have changed so much from even just a year ago. So just trying to come to grips with what's to come and what the landscape looks like. I appreciate that deep dive, but I'm not going to let you off the hook quite yet because I do want to talk to you a little bit. Being in the DC area. I know you were covering AZ Fudd, one of the fan favorites here at UConn from her early days. Just I'm curious what was your first impression the first time you really got to see AZ play?
Yeah, it's a great question. I appreciate you asking. I
Yeah.
I wrote about AZ before her freshman year at St. John's in DC. I was on the high school beat. It was 2017, I believe, and I started to get phone calls from AAU coaches and coaches being like, you have to write about this girl. I mean, she's incredible. And I wrote this in my newsletter after the NCAA tournament this year, but they were throwing around like crazy superlatives, like she should play with the boys, or she should be the first one and done in women's college basketball if it were legal, or she could skip
Yes.
college altogether and go to the pros, like all these things that were sort of typical for like men's prospects, right?
Yeah.
People were saying about AZ. And I was, of course, interested. And I went over to their house in Virginia and met her parents and AZ and did an interview. And she was great. I thought she was really funny and sort of mature beyond her years at the time. And that was before I even saw her play. And then she's just incredible. I mean, I just like I remember some like stop and start moves and crossovers and step back jumpers and just like things that freshmen in high school aren't doing, and just was like amazed by her talent, and then would go to some workouts and wrote some additional stories about her. One of them was that her mom and her shooting form were like almost identically the same. Her mom was a
Oh,
fantastic player at Georgetown, ended up having her career ended by injuries, but like they had this like identical shooting form, and just watching them work together like on like a Saturday in an empty gym and AZ making like dozens of threes in a row. I mean, UConn fans are well aware of her shooting ability, but
yeah.
just from the beginning, it just felt like a really different athlete, and it was really cool to see them not just win this past year, but her to play so well because of what she'd been through, right? Like her
Yeah.
path to that moment was not linear at all, and it rarely ever is. But just to, I mean, even following from afar over the years, when I was covering baseball still, or just getting back on college sports, I would often see the headlines and be like, man, another injury or like another setback, or she's going to miss multiple months or a season, and it just felt like maybe she would never get to that level that she would always hoped to or was kind of promised. And then she did, and I thought that was really cool. And the fact that she's going to come back for one more year, I'm really excited to see what she does with that too. Obviously, Paige not being there, it's a different team, but yeah, I mean, I could talk for a while about AZ. It's just a really fascinating story.
All right. Well, I'm sure in a few months when everything goes crazy in some other direction around college sports, we could have you back on. We
Be
can
great.
dive into some more AZ talk
Yeah.
and what's going on. But Jesse, I really appreciate it. Definitely. Before you go, just let everyone know where they could find you on social and in the great newsletter you've got.
Yeah, so I'm at Dougherty underscore Jesse on X. I'm more often on Blue Sky, just my name. And then I write for the Post, Washington Post, and then also do a newsletter on Substack called What's Up with College Sports. You can search me there. Sort of a complement to my newspaper coverage where I kind of provide additional thoughts and insights and also sort of package my stuff and send it out. So multiple ways to find me, and I appreciate you giving me a chance to share.
Yeah, definitely will. Jesse, thanks so much. Enjoy the summer before college sports really get back into full swing. So thanks so much.
Thank you.